This is my first Climate Leadership Conference, so I anticipate learning so much from all of you over the next couple days. And I am incredibly honored to be moderating this panel with these fellow resilience leaders. As Amy mentioned, I serve as Assistant Secretary for Climate Change at the California Natural Resources Agency. And in that role, I help to lead and coordinate our work on nature-based solutions, climate resilience, and international engagement. So I'm sure there's lots of interesting conversations I can have with all of you, and especially this panel. So over the next 45 or so minutes, we're going to dig into leadership and governance on climate change resilience, and specifically how are we thinking about how best to structure resilience in states and different regions, in different organizations. And we're also going to dig into innovative funding and financing mechanisms, as well as innovative policies. So without saying too much more, I would love to introduce our three panelists. And after I do that, I'll let them share a little bit more about what brings them to this space and this field, what they think about and work on each and every day. And then we'll have some questions, a conversation among the four of us, and we'll then invite you all to ask a few questions of us. So we're definitely wanting to keep this dialogue heavy, free form, and things like that, so we can really get something out of this conversation. So we will first be hearing from Melissa Hoffer, who's the first climate chief with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I think she's been in this role for just a few months, so 4 months. So very excited to hear from you. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Austin Shelton, who is the director of the University of Guam Center for Island Sustainability and Sea Grant. And last but not least, we'll hear from Dr. Crystal Upperman, who's a senior manager in Deloitte. So I would love to hear a little bit from each of you, starting with you, Melissa, on your work in climate resilience, what you're thinking about day in and day out, what are your top priorities and big focus by way of introduction, and then we can go to Austin and then Crystal. Great. So over to you.
Thank you. And hello, everybody. And I wanted to just thank the conference organizers. I'm really pleased to be here with everyone today. I was hoping we might get that Fleetwood Mac for our walk-on music, but close enough. And I wanted to just start a little bit by talking about this position. So when Governor Healy was elected, she issued an executive order that established the Office of Climate Innovation and Resilience and the position of climate chief. So it's the first cabinet-level climate position in state government. And we did that for a couple of reasons. Number one is, I was just listening to the introductory remarks about how some of us have been in this space for such a long time. And I certainly have, and I don't know about you, but I feel a really big difference in the past couple of years in how much people understand the imperative to really go after it in a way that we haven't before. It's a moment, there's kind of a sea change, I think, and you can sort of feel this paradigm shift happening. So we wanted to make sure that we were maximizing our ability in the Commonwealth as being a leader on so many climate initiatives, along with New York and California and other states, to take advantage of that and drive climate change throughout all of our government agencies. So it's a real whole-of-government approach that we are taking. The Commonwealth has had very innovative climate legislation and policies in place since at least 2008. We were one of the first states to pass a Global Warming Solutions Act, a Green Communities Act, and that was a long time ago. So one might wonder, why is it that, we've got beautiful statutes and wonderful regulations and, terrific policy, but we're not really where we need to be. We've done a very good job of cleaning up our grid in New England. It's in large part because we've seen, a number, almost all coal retirements. I think we have one coal-fired power plant still operating up in Bow, New Hampshire. And then we saw, the coming online of Marcellus Shale, which did a lot to make coal economically not competitive. But as far as transportation and buildings, we have a really long way to go. So looking at it, our feeling was it's not just an environmental issue. climate change is an issue that belongs and needs to be owned by our Office of Housing and Economic Development, Health and Human Services, Department of Transportation, Emergency Response. All of these agencies, education, they need to really play their role. And so that's why we're doing this. That's the import of it. And the way that we're doing it is through a framework that is established in the executive order that creates an administrative infrastructure. Because we talk a lot about the technology for dealing with climate change, workforce needs, financial barriers, but we also need innovation in the way that we run our businesses and in the way that we govern. And so this is one way to get at that. And what we did was we established what we're calling climate secretariat officers in every agency. So every agency in the Commonwealth, every executive branch agency now has a SCO that is responsible for developing a plan to implement either legislatively mandated emissions reductions goals or come up with a plan. We have statutes and regs in place that require certain agencies to take action, and where agencies don't have those, they have to come up with a plan. So I'll pause there. I know there will be more opportunity to talk, but those are basically the how we did it and why we did it answers to your question.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Melissa. We also in the state of California are taking a very similar approach as far as really embedding our resilience work across every agency, department, and organization. And we did this in the last update of our state adaptation strategy. So it's nice to hear states that are thinking about this and also how we can learn from one another about what's working, what's not working, how we can effectively track progress towards this work. So I hope we can dig into that a little bit later. Next up, would love to hear a little bit from you, Austin, about your work, your priorities, and what really keeps you driven and focused in this field.
Thanks, Jen. Hoffer day, everybody. My name's Austin Shelton. I serve as the director of the University of Guam Center for Island Sustainability and Sea Grant. So it's really a pleasure to be here at the Climate Leadership Conference and to be able to share a little bit about what we're doing in Guam. Because climate change is definitely a clear and present danger in Guam and other islands. So Guam is a U.S. territory on the other side of the Pacific. If you've been to Hawaii, you just got to get on a plane and go 7 hours more on another fun flight, and you would be there on a 33-mile island by about 8 miles wide. We have 165,000 people. But it's a really beautiful place because we have things like the most diverse coral reefs in the United States. And we have hundreds of species of different reef fish and algae, but they're definitely under threat right now. And I've seen this growing up right by the beach in Guam. I used to fish and snorkel with my dad, and as I grew up doing that, I saw that the beautiful coral reefs just weren't as vibrant and colorful as they used to be. I wasn't catching the same size and quality of fish that we used to have there in the waters, and so something was wrong, and myself and a bunch of other friends went off to school and started trying to learn about what we could do to fix these issues. And so we found out that there was work to do in creating more resilience to global impacts of climate change that we can be doing, but we also have to get out there to conferences like this to create partnerships locally, regionally, nationally, internationally to make sure that we're all taking action on climate change so we can save places wherever we live, but also these special places where islands are affecting indigenous communities, populations, but also rich biodiversity. So one of the actions that we're taking in Guam is to really take a leadership role in creating our sustainable future. And sustainability or sustainable development means that we're meeting the needs of today without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. And for us, that also means that we just want to live in Guam like we intend to stay there. And we're really fortunate to have leadership from the top of our island all the way down to the community level that really believe in this. And so I'm really thankful to my Lieutenant Governor Joshua Tenorio for being here. If you could raise your hand, sir. And he's going to be speaking on the closing plenary. And also a colleague, Robson Augustine, who is working on social issues in Guam and in charge of one of our homeless programs there. So we are bringing the message about the importance of working on not just environmental issues, but the social aspects, the human society aspects, the economic aspects. And what we did a couple years ago in Guam was form the Guam Green Growth Initiative, which we now call our island's most comprehensive public-private partnership ever created to achieve a sustainable future. So our governor and lieutenant governor formed the Guam Green Growth Initiative and appointed 100 working group members representing all sectors of our society. And we aligned with the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We created hundreds of different action items that we're continuing to implement today. So we've got a lot of exciting action projects that are happening on the ground now in Guam. We have things like a Guam Green Growth Circular Economy Makerspace and Innovation Hub, where we can take waste products, turn them into new marketable products, and create green industries for the island. We're training people through a Guam Green Growth Conservation Corps. We're improving food security with community gardens, and doing so much more that I'm excited to share with people today about just these bright spots that islands are doing, taking action as we can locally to build up that resilience against these global impacts of climate change that are at our shore and getting worse every day, but we're doing our best to survive that and thrive and to have that sustainable future where we can enjoy our island for generations to come. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you, Austin. And it's really interesting to hear how you're looking to international frameworks like the Sustainable Development Goals and embedding it in the work you're doing to kind of track progress and have a public dashboard. So we'll be excited to talk about that later as well. Last but not least, Crystal, would love to hear from you about your work day in and day out, and perhaps some work on health that we've talked about and work in the federal funding landscape as well.
Happy to share about that, Jen. You know, as I hear Austin just mention about his upbringing, it brings me back to how I ended up in this field to begin with, having, you know, grown up on a Caribbean island and immigrated to the U.S. at a young age and seeing the differences between an island that has a lot of biodiversity versus inner city New Jersey and the differences that exist there. And it brings me down to the critical aspect of the fact that we're all here to try and tackle this thing called climate change, but the same issues that are leading to climate change, the same pollution is the same pollution that's causing health problems for people who are living in close proximity to all of these sites that are emitting emissions across the board or contaminating our water. And, you know, at the center of that, as we address climate change as a whole, we also have to think about the intersection of health and the role that that plays in the society in which we live and people's ability to show up. And you mentioned the recent pieces of legislation in the opening remarks. Since we last met, the Inflation Reduction Act has been passed, and central to that piece of legislation is the fact of making sure that disadvantaged communities receive a certain proportion of the benefits by way of the recent, 2 years ago, Executive Order 14008, by which investments for climate change, addressing climate change, renewable energy, clean transportation, and the likes, 40% of those benefits are to accrue in these disadvantaged communities. And that actually is what gives me hope in present day. For someone who's been in this field for a really long time, talking about the need to recycle and then the need to change out light bulbs and then the need, you know, for us to upcycle. And now we're at a moment where we actually have investments at a national scale to really put a lot of momentum behind the changes that need to happen. That's what's giving me hope today. What I see across the board is a grand opportunity for us to at least point things in the right direction. We're seeing that a lot of our clients are in need for help trying to figure out how to even define a disadvantaged community. Who are those communities consisting of? How do you even track the idea of benefits? And how do you accrue benefits across the board? So that's often a challenge that we're seeing presently. But across the board, really excited for this moment and excited to have this conversation with the distinguished panelists that we have here today.
Great. Thank you very much.
Of course.
So I heard a lot of themes from each of you about, you know, the rise of focusing on climate resilience, the rise of also embedding it in everything we do, and really sort of that structural and transformational change that is needed and that we're stepping up to at this moment. So I would love to hear a little bit more from each of you about, how has embedding resilience in your operations, in all of government, really shaped conversations around financing and mobilizing funding and financing, and how has it also alleviated any challenges of setting aside this upfront investment in climate adaptation and climate resilience?
Wow, that's if you don't, I'm happy to contribute to that. Such a fascinating question, because when we talk about this thing about investments, we generally think about various sectors that have to make investments, either it's private, public, or multilateral when you're thinking internationally. And in 2019, the World Resources Institute released a report that came out from their Global Commission on Adaptation. And this was like a report that was centered around strumming up political will and financial investment for climate adaptation action primarily, because at that point in time, mitigation was receiving a lot of attention. And there was an economic evaluation that looked at about 5 different sectors. And the economic evaluation looked at if you invested about $1.7 trillion in about 5 climate solutions, climate adaptation solutions, that actually the return on that investment would be about $7.1 trillion. So that started making the economic case for much of this. And then that narrative is actually what started as the impetus for the current investment that we've seen through a few of the pieces of legislation. But then across the board, there's a need for investment in a myriad of different ways, and that investment can look different, whether you're looking at it here domestically in the US or internationally. I don't know if the...
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And whenever we're engaged in these conversations about investment and finance, I think it's really important, and this is starting to happen more, it's really important to ask, well, what is the cost of doing nothing? Because it's really true that doing stuff is expensive. It's very expensive. Resilience for Boston Harbor, for example, is estimated to be like somewhere around $3 billion. But that's a bargain compared to doing nothing. It's actually also a bargain compared to what it costs us to clean up the pollution that was in Boston Harbor and build the Nut Island treatment plant, which was about $4.7 billion. So I think that frame is really helpful, and an investment in the future. So what's really interesting and exciting, I think, what's happening now with the IRA is the concept of, like the leverage ratio, right? So, we see now the concept that, like, okay, if we want to kind of finance some of this deep decarbonization that's been hard to get the private sector to step in, like lots of people want to build solar. Our subsidies were great, set that market on fire. It's probably not going to need subsidy that much longer. It's really going, and it's making a profit, and it's good. On the other hand, there are lots of spaces, like decarbonization of affordable housing, for example, that need to be de-risked before people feel comfortable coming to the table and making those investments. And that's where the innovation of the IRA really comes in and is going to allow that money to flow through. EPA hasn't yet issued the final guidelines for it, but the basic concept is $27 billion, $7 billion of it essentially to solar, $20 billion to 2 pots that will be regional in nature, and then we'll either be there likely for co-investing for an entity like the one that we are contemplating establishing. So what does that mean? It means then that you've got an influx of money that will go potentially to CDFIs or green banks that can then leverage other private investment, can leverage philanthropic investment, can bring other dollars to the table. And I think if I remember correctly, the Connecticut Green Bank right now has a leverage ratio of 7-to-1. So that is for every dollar that Connecticut is putting in, it's getting $7 worth of investment. And so the Green Bank, is recycling. You're getting loans paid back in most circumstances. You're using that money again, and you're bringing other money to the table. So, when I'm thinking about programs that we're doing in the Commonwealth, and we do some very, very good grant programs. We have a municipal vulnerability preparedness program. We're about to issue the 2.0 version of that. That helps municipalities do the kind of planning that will make them more resilient to climate change impacts in the future. That's a straight grant program. That's a good use of our dollars. It's not leveraging other dollars, though. So I think we're really starting to think about, like, okay, what can we start to finance with a potential green bank in Massachusetts that's really going to allow us to get more bang for our buck? And I think the Biden administration's been very intentional about spurring that kind of thinking, and now that, of course, is happening across the board in all the states. And the way that the money is flowing from IRA and through other, through DOE and through DOT, there's lots of money available right now, is also making, in some ways, the states are kind of forced to de-silo, which is also good. You have to have your DEPs talking to your DOTs, and you have to have those folks, talking with what's happening on the resilience side. So I think that has also been, an intentional strategy for, forcing some of this cross-cutting conversation that's so vital right now.
Great, thank you. So just to maybe pick up on that thread a bit, how are you, often I think what we're talking about public-private partnerships and leveraging this financing is so critical, but I think we still do see silos in our economic groups and agencies and divisions with kind of our people that are focused really on climate. We see this, of course, across government, state and federal, right? But also our stakeholder groups and others. So how are you all thinking about that, and are you seeing some of your approaches to whole of government and embedding resilience in everything you do, kind of breaking those silos down, especially now at this moment with the Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, the initiative that I mentioned was the Guam Green Growth Initiative, when we have this set of 100 working group members working all across different sectors. So that's been a really valuable framework for us to be working on climate. Throughout all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that we're working on, we put 13 as a cross-cutting goal, which is climate action. So that's something that everybody is working on collectively, whether they're focusing on goals like no poverty or zero hunger or industry and innovation. Climate action is something that everybody has to think about, that there's action items there that are collective, as I mentioned. But I just wanted to go back real quickly to the financing thing, because that's something that we are all working on as these 100 working group members have to figure out, how are we going to fund all of these different projects? Now, islands around the world are one of the big issues that prime ministers or presidents of island nations bring up, is that we need urgent access to climate financing. And they have these big pots of money after the Paris Agreement called the GCF, or the Green Climate Fund. And islands are desperate for this. But you know what's considered quick to get that funding for urgent adaptation projects? 2 years is like the quickest you can get $1 out of that program. So as a U.S. territory in Guam, we don't have access to that funding at all. But we do have access today to the Inflation Reduction Act, to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And we actually just had a bunch of island territories together this week in Honolulu. I stopped there on the way here. We're trying to work with other islands to make sure that everybody is strategically putting in grant proposals. With our limited capacity, it's very difficult to be going after every opportunity. There are millions and billions of dollars out there, but we do need mechanisms to make it a little easier for us, and that's where it comes from. The environmental justice concept. We just got funding to be from the U.S. EPA to be part of an environmental justice technical assistance center, where we can start breaking down some of those barriers. So there's progress, but there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that islands, the places that are the most vulnerable to climate change, that contributed the least to the causes of climate change, are able to access that funding in a strategic way that works for our communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Jen, a whole of government approach is truly the moment that we've been waiting for. It requires every agency to actually think about this and have a response to this embedded in their mission, because we know, I'm not going to preach to the choir here, but it's going to impact every single sector across the board. And it's really critical to make sure that there is a central focus on figuring out how the impacts are going to disrupt the ability for entities to achieve their set mission and objectives. So this whole of government approach makes it easier to have that conversation, but it also makes it easier to actually direct resources in a way that's meaningful and supportive of solutions that are really going to affect change. Another thing that I think it infiltrates the broader society as a whole, where now people cannot look at their jobs just as their insular siloed jobs. Every job is now a climate job, because we know that it takes every single person in every single role thinking about not only their responsibilities, but how this phenomena is going to impact their ability for them to contribute and their missions to be met. So I think it's a really great driving force, but I also think that it requires us to also open up the aperture to allow others who generally won't have a seat at the table or don't have a seat at the table to actually inform and bring ideas that can provide solutions. So I'm talking about the community engagement that's necessary and required. When we realize that there is this grand problem that we need to solve, we do need to bring a lot of solutions into the fold, and many times the solutioning can be hard to develop, but you have to go to the people that are closest to the problem to help figure out the solution. So this is where much of the community engagement that's necessary to develop locally led action and solutions, it becomes critical and important. So I think this idea of a whole of government approach is really a good North Star to help us move things in the right direction.
Yeah, I just want to give you 3 kind of concrete examples of how this is coming to the fore. And I wasn't quite sure what to expect in coming into this position. I really wasn't sure what the receptivity would be from the staff and the leadership of the other agencies. And much to our surprise and my delight, there was a pent-up demand for people taking this issue on. I had people calling us from our office of it's the procurement office, essentially saying, hey, we have 10 ideas that we've really been wanting to do. Can we talk to you about this? So that, just in terms of the atmosphere, that was really encouraging. And I wanted to give 3 particular examples, and we can just tick through them quickly. But workforce, for example, we have a labor and workforce cabinet that is comprised of our Secretary of Labor and Workforce, our Secretary of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and Economic Development and Education. So they come together in this workforce skills cabinet, and they selected climate as their #1 priority. In Massachusetts, we have a quasi-governmental agency that's the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and they do a lot of the sort of demographics on labor. We have 30 to 40,000 worker shortage for everything across the board. Like, this is for building the windmills and doing the HVAC, and we have a chronic, like everybody else, shortage of electricians. So, really thinking about how we're going to do we have great training programs, actually. We have quite good clean energy training programs, but we need more, and where we have a problem is plugging those people into jobs once they get out of those programs. So that's one really good example of they're doing that. I have nothing to do with that. I mean, I'm hearing what they're doing, but they're on it, and they're leading it, and they're moving it forward. Our Education Secretary, Pat Tutwiler, just around Earth Day, announced the establishment of a new innovation career pathway for clean energy. So that's terrific. The second example is Health and Human Services. Our Department of Public Health lives within that agency. Secretary Kate Walsh is running that secretariat. And DPH had created a couple years ago an EJ tool. Essentially looks at social determinants of health and then kind of figures out, across the state who's at most risk based on that. And so what they are doing this year, they just picked climate change as their top priority for data collection. So what that means is now we're going to get a bunch of data that helps us understand better the relationship between climate change and public health. We can feed that into our tool, and that's going to help us make better policy decisions. So just very concretely, what will that look like? What is the relationship between taking certain medications and what your reaction might be during an extreme heat event? What is your risk if you are living in an area where during extreme heat events you have higher ground level ozone and you've got a lot of kids who are more vulnerable to asthma in the first place? What do we need to do about that? So that's really helpful because that's going to help us direct resources for things like establishing cooling centers. We're also working closely with hospitals to figure out what their resilience plans are going to be. Some of you might have seen we had a very unusual weather event in February in New England where we saw record-breaking cold. It was -17 where I live. It was -40 with wind chill where I live. And we had 21, I believe, code black events at our hospitals, which means they can't take patients. And what happened was it got so cold, many of the pipes are still in exterior walls, that pipes burst. One hospital had a fire in connection with some of that flooding. And so, we're not where we need to be in being prepared for some of these extreme weather events. So that's got us talking about tabletop exercises and thinking much more carefully about that. The other thing the hospitals are very concerned about is supply chain issues. Some of you on the East Coast may have already been affected by this, but during Hurricane Maria, for example, Puerto Rico makes a bunch of the IV bags. So we had IV bag shortage. And so we're thinking about resilience in that regard as well. And obviously we had very recent experience with that with COVID. So that's Health and Human Services. And then the last I wanted to touch on is Administration and Finance is our agency that controls all of our budgeting. And living within that is our Operational Services Division, which does all of the procurement. So we've been thinking with them very actively about how do we essentially bake in carbon pricing. We can't really do a social cost of carbon. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. It's very technical. It makes it difficult for the vendors. It's hard to do on a case-by-case transaction. But what we can do is adopt what the federal government has been doing, which is, we are moving towards a place where we're going to be asking folks to tell us what their carbon disclosure, consistent with CDP, what their emissions are. Tell us what their plan is to be reducing emissions. Tell us what your climate risk is, whether it's physical or transition risk, much like you would be required to do if, in fact, the SEC's proposed rule passes. So this is a way where, even at the get-go, if we're not going to make a decision to contract with you based on that disclosure at this time, we at least want you to start thinking about those things, because in the near-term future, we likely will be making decisions about whether to contract with you based on what you're doing in terms of your carbon emissions and your ability to control them. So those are some ways that we can move that conversation, and we're excited about it, but that gives you some sense of what does whole of government look like.
And to double click on something that you shared, Melissa, when you mentioned the aspect of climate and health, and in 2013, there were a series of cities and states across the US who had the BRACE grantee awarded to them. And what the BRACE stood for was building resilience against climate effects. That's just to draw the parallel between then and now. And so in 2013, these programs were stood up through CDC by way of congressional appropriation. So CDC had gotten these dollars through congressional appropriation to then give to cities and states to evaluate how climate change was going to impact the health of their populations. That was 2013. All of these respective locations did these evaluations, some of the stuff that Melissa shared about looking at where heating and cooling centers would be necessary given extreme temperature fluctuations, where you would have folks who would need to be rushed to hospitals more frequently given poor air quality. And then we fast forward now to 2023, where we now have an agency that is established, HHS, which has established a climate and health office in and of itself. A climate and health office within the agency that's now to look at the impact of climate change on health for the entire US. So it's no longer a siloed process. And this has happened primarily because of an all-of-government approach, realizing the importance and significance that the health of our population has towards our GDP as a whole, and wanting to essentially mitigate for that moving forward. So we really have come along a long way, but this idea of whole of government contributes to things like that.
Great, thank you. So let's do one or two more questions, and then I'd love to hear from any questions you all have in the audience for our panelists. And sort of building on what we talked about sort of the impacts in front of us right now, the experience that you were talking about, Austin, in Guam, and some of the stories you're telling us just of this past year in Massachusetts. How do you balance that, structurally, programmatically, policy-wise? How are you thinking about, obviously, these urgent interventions that are needed to respond to crises and needed to, mobilize people and resources quickly, as well as this other piece we're talking about the culture change and the transformational change that is really needed, and it's starting, right? But it's not here quite yet. So how are you balancing that? How do you make sure you keep that big picture? Where are we going for building a resilient, world economy environment as we're also dealing with the urgency and the things that are right in front of us now. And of course, we feel this dynamic in California all the time, especially coming off our prolonged drought and then our extreme flooding that we're still going through right now. It's how are we kind of keeping the big picture, and how are we thinking about the state's overall vision on resilience as we're responding to crises?
Wow. Well, I can kick it off.
Sure.
This is not a programmatic answer, so I'm interested to hear some of the programmatic thoughts about it. But one thing that's become super clear to me in this tiny bit of time on this job, 4 months, is the dialogue is extremely important. And I don't know if you all are finding this, but I am finding after events like this, or I'm talking to different groups in Massachusetts, people are much more willing to come up to me afterwards and say, some of these investments are going to take a really, really long payback time. Some of them aren't going to pay back, but we have to do them anyway. And, we're kind of getting to a place we're worried. And so my invitation is, could you please say that out loud? Would you please say it out loud in a public forum so that your peers who are running other businesses and institutions and other government, areas understand that they're not alone? I think a lot of people are starting to really understand that. So number one is to have the conversation, because it's just starting to sink in. We have a climate cabinet. Our cabinet meets every Friday with the governor and the lieutenant governor, and I established a climate cabinet. It was one of the first things I did, and I meet with all the secretaries once a month, and the first thing that I did with them is do a 101 on climate science. And I can tell you, these are people who are extremely accomplished in their fields. The fact that there is an atmospheric residence time for carbon dioxide that is on the order of centuries was new to them. Mm-hmm. That if you turned off all the carbon dioxide machines today, we'd still be stuck with these effects was a new fact. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a new fact for a lot of people. So just kind of helping get that idea socialized so we understand. And then the non-programmatic thing is I have had the opportunity to speak with a number of people, including some doctors. We had a group of medical doctors come in to meet with us a couple weeks ago. One was a clinical psychiatrist at MGH. The other was a doctor who works with kids. Kids are having a very, very difficult time, not just because of climate change, but we're seeing a lot more anxiety and depression show up in youth, at least in Massachusetts. I think that's a national, if not global, phenomenon. And we had a public health doctor there who was from Maryland. And he was really urging the fact that the things that make these kids feel better is knowing that they can do something, some action, some translate. We heard this at lunchtime, right? Try to shift that to anger so that you can feel some action or be active about it. So we've established a Youth Climate Council. That's a piece of it. But I think the same thing is true for adults. So he is urging, and one of the things that he's been working on is establishing these resilience councils. And I think that we will probably move towards doing some pilot so that we're having these conversations in some group. There's 351 towns and cities in Massachusetts, so the state government isn't going to be able to facilitate that for every city and town. But I think we can do it for a handful and see what works and get people talking about it. What are you going to do the next Arctic blast? What does happen when we have a lot of power outages now? What does happen when the power goes down? What's our plan for helping each other? And there are a lot of data about that. You've probably seen these. The French heat wave, for example, in 2005, I think on the order of 30,000 people died during that heat wave. Well, the French learned their lesson. Last summer, there was a comparable heat wave, and I think they had almost zero mortality. Why? Because they changed things. They have air conditioning in some places, but neighbors knew to go, they knew who was living alone, and they knew to go knock on that door and see if that person was okay. So that's sort of where I think we have to move with resilience now, while we are at the same time doing all the stuff on mitigation. It's not an either or, it's simultaneous, and that is requiring a lot of resources from all of us.
One concrete example that I have for building capacity and also creating, hopefully, cultural transformation at the same time is that with the support of our governor and lieutenant governor, we created the Guam Green Growth Conservation Corps, which is a workforce development program that prepares our community for the emerging green economy. And so what that means is that we hire at least 15 people per year to work full-time for 5 months straight, and they get training on agriculture, aquaculture, renewable energy, invasive species removal, And they go out in the community in a big Guam Green Growth van with all the sustainable development goals. They go from village to village, and they go out and they start farming. They start doing aquaculture. They install hundreds of solar panels on top of our local schools, and they bring volunteers along the way. So we can only hire a few people at a time, but the amount of attention and community support that they bring along the way is just, it's incredible that they're able to achieve this. And there's also a weekly island beautification event where they even can get daycare kids to come out with them to pick up litter along the roadways or paint murals or fences and things like that. But we have been seeing some success in this program, and we've actually been adding on additional Conservation Corps programs now. So we have a full-time program where we can place new Conservation Corps members into agencies like the National Park Service or our local Department of Agriculture Forestry Division. And then we spun off another program to create the Guam Green Growth Art Corps, where there's our talented artists bringing out the social issues related to climate change and sustainability are now painting murals on huge open walls throughout the island. And lastly, we've just got funding last week to create a special conservation corps for our students that are coming from the region, places like the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, from the islands around us, that we give them a special conservation corps on weekends and holidays for the students that live in our University of Guam dormitories. And then after they graduate, they bring these skills back home too. And there's also a couple National Science Foundation grants where we have hundreds of opportunities now to train our students in marine, environmental, and sustainability sciences. So we're hopefully getting a lot better at taking care of our resilience needs locally while we're trying to bring the message, as I said earlier, to global sustainability.
Great.
Well, this idea of transformation, structural and both transformational change that needs to happen, you know, Deloitte saw this as like coming into fruition primarily on our commercial and public sector side. The firm itself has invested and is continuing to invest $1 billion in bringing climate solutions into the fold. This serves as like an incubator for a lot of the solutions that our clients will need. So we're proving and testing those out and bringing them before our clients, because oftentimes the upfront investment is not always readily available. So we've, as a firm, have invested in that. We've now have a sustainability, climate, and climate equity strategic growth offering, by which we're not only just helping with things like achieving net zero and doing carbon accounting, we're also helping to figure out how to do climate resiliency more equitably, and we're also incubating that internally through a series of training. So making sure that our internal talent understand what climate forcing is and how the phenomena shows up, in addition to understanding environmental justice and also climate justice, because as I mentioned before, every job is a climate job in modern day, and it's seldom that you'll have a conversation with a client and the topic of one of those key words not arise. So we, as a firm, see it as a really critical and important aspect for us to also make sure that we are well prepared to help our clients achieve the intended outcomes that they want to see. So that's how we're viewing the idea around structural and transformational change that's necessary, serving to just be a catalyst in this space.
Great, thank you. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I would love to see if there's one or two questions from the audience, and I think we have someone that can run a mic around.
Hi, sorry, I'm going to stand up because I'm in like the perfectly wrong place to be seen by you guys. Hi, my name is Emily Faint. I work for the British Standards Institution, which is the UK member body of ISO, so sort of net zero standards and governance is my area of interest. If I may, I'd love to ask two quick questions. One to Austin on, from sort of the island perspective that you've really sort of helpfully set out today, do you have any thoughts about the recent sort of victory, I suppose is the right word, from the small island state of Vanuatu to get the International Court of Justice to give an opinion on whether companies can be legally liable for not doing enough to combat climate change, and whether that might help with some of the red tape issues you've highlighted, like the Green Climate Fund not giving you funds unless it's been 2 years. So I'd love your thoughts on that. And then also, Crystal, you mentioned about some really important work on environmental health and the sort of health impacts and benefits of net zero and taking action on climate change. Could you give us maybe some more insights into the different ways in which those benefits are being shown, and how that is something that maybe other people here can use as an evidence base to argue for their own organizations to take more action? Thank you.
Well, to answer your first question just real quickly about the Vanuatu case in front of the United Nations, just want to say that we're really proud in Guam that that case was argued by somebody from Guam. One of my best friends, Julian Uggan. And Melissa was just telling me she read his book recently. It's called No Country for Eight-Spotted Butterfly. No Country for Eight-Spotted Butterfly. I encourage you to read that. It's a really interesting take from a human rights environmental lawyer and also a real big climate activist. So if you can read that and see a little bit more about that, those perspectives. Yeah, he's really the expert in bringing attention for islands, as Jen and I were talking a little bit earlier, islands don't want to be called small island developing states. We're actually big ocean states because we've got so much ocean around us. If you were to come to our region in Guam and Micronesia, you can drop the whole contiguous United States into the water like 1.5 times. We've got so much ocean and resources there. And we don't want to get lost because there's some issues with our climate impacts that, if we're as sea levels continue to rise, what happens if we do lose our slivers of land? What happens to our sovereignty? Do islands not exist anymore, or do we still own the ocean in those areas? And what are we doing for all of these rights potentially being taken away from us by external forces? So this case, like the Vanuatu one, is a really important one that islands are getting a little more traction and hopefully more recognition on the world stage to save these very precious and diverse areas of our planet.
Wow. Well, to answer that question in terms of benefits and how we're seeing it show up across the board, there are a couple of measures right now in terms of safety that we're seeing across interested parties. Safety is a big thing, so an increase in safety that's being bolstered by some of the changes. Reduced emissions and pollution across the board is also another measure and a benefit that we're seeing that accrues, and that has both of those have tangible impacts to health. And then also an uptick in green jobs as a whole in respective locations that can and need to benefit from them, because we know that a workforce that is highly employed also has increased health outcomes. So those are just 3 of the top line benefits that we're seeing across the board showing up as markers that we can track in modern time. And into the future, those benefits are definitely going to become a bit more highly resolved. But to answer the question, those are the top 3 that we're seeing.
Great. So I think we have to wrap up, and I want to make sure we're giving enough time for the next very exciting panel. But thank you all for this conversation. I learned so much from each of you, so appreciate the time. And I just want to leave you with one thought. I feel like we spent a lot of time on transformational change and structural change and the culture change that's needed right now to really become resilient to climate change and the future impacts. And I think we're hearing that it's exciting. There's energy, there's people wanting to meet this moment, but there's also a lot more that we need to do as far as job training and workforce development, as Austin talked about. So I think we're at this exciting inflection point for our community on climate resilience, and therefore the community of all of us, since it is touching everything we do. So thank you again, and hopefully if you all have other questions, you can find us at the break or the reception. So appreciate it.